Participants. We are co-hosting this webinar with our colleagues from the Office of Victims of Crime, and we will talk to you a bit more about our partnerships in a few minutes. But before we do our official welcome, I wanted to start the call and provide an opportunity for my colleague Nancy Wan from the Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence to give you all a few logistics about the webinar. Nancy?
Thank you, Shondell. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. And before we begin, I want to introduce the technology we'll be using and some of its features. So internet audio is available for those who choose to listen using their speakers or headphones connected to their computer. Or you can listen where most of you are in integrated teleconference by dialing in. And given that we have over 900 registered participants today, everyone is muted to preserve sound quality and reduce ambient noise. I provided the dial-in number on the screen as well as a passcode. But should you have any difficulty, I would recommend calling iLink Technical Support at 1-800-799-4510. And they would be best able to assist you. And since we're all on mute, we're going to encourage you all to use the chat box. And for most of you, it's located on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And simply type in a message. Many of you have already been using it. Or you see type your message here and click on the gray box with the arrow to send it. And feel free to write in your questions and your comments and engage in conversation with each other throughout the webinar. And we'll address your questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. We may not have time to address all the questions you may have, but you can also email your questions to us, and we'll share the presenter's contact information. And please note that the chat is public, so it is open and visible to everyone, so wouldn't share any confidential information there. And I want to take a moment to practice using the chat box by introducing yourself by typing in your organization name and city and state. For me, Nancy Wan, I would write API Institute on Domestic Violence and San Francisco, California. Let me try that out now. So get a sense of who's in the room. So I'll give folks some time to do that.
Repeat.
Oh, wow, there's a lot of this. All right, I think people know how to use this feature. And then also want to talk about participant engagement. So we wanted to make this webinar engaging and participatory. So we'll be asking for your feedback at different points of the presentation. So we'll ask you to respond to simple polls in the feedback box, which is for most of you above the chat box. And you might have to click on the little triangle to expand it or collapse it, but it should say, it will reveal options such as yes or no, true or false, or A, B, C, and D. And you can indicate your response by clicking on the radio button next to each selection. And the cool part is that participants see the results in real time, and the pie chart will change based on responses. And we're going to practice that right now. So if you can all answer this question, what is your professional capacity? Victim service provider, healthcare provider, social service provider, or federal or state program? You can right-click on this, and then flip. All right, I see that we have 56% victim service providers on this webinar today. That's pretty cool. All right, we're going to try one more. I'm going to clear this one, so we're going to do another one that is a yes or no. Do you provide direct services to traffic victims? I'll give you all a few moments to respond. Okay, it looks like we have mostly yes. About 85 and increasing. All right, so you all know how to use the feedback section. And then and everyone's favorite question, the PowerPoint slides for today's presentation will be shared via email to everyone who participated and all those who registered as well. And you'll receive a link to the materials and a link to the recording of the webinar following the session. So it might take me a couple of hours, so be patient and check in tonight or tomorrow, and you'll get an email from me when it's done. And last but not least, when you exit, you'll see a brief survey pop up about this webinar, and we encourage you to take a moment to respond. We do take your feedback into consideration in our future webinars and how we present them. And so with that, I will pass it on back to Shondell to introduce our organizers and our speakers for today.
Thank you, Nancy. So we're thrilled to see over 900 of you have joined us today in talking about trauma-informed services for survivors of trafficking. This is a very important issue across the administration as well as for the President, and we wanted to join today to share some expertise among both our offices with the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program as well as with the Office of Victims of Crime on this issue. For those of you who don't know, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program administers the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which provides a primary federal funding stream for local domestic violence programs, state domestic violence coalitions, tribes and tribal programs, and national resource centers, as well as the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And through that work, we have been looking very closely at the issues of not only domestic violence, intimate partner violence and stalking, but also the traumatic impacts of that, as well as offering some collaborative support with our colleagues who are doing work on trafficking. The FIPSA program has been working here within HHS with our colleagues, Catherine Chone, as well as across the federal government, including the Office of Violence Against Women, the Office of Victims of Crime, and the Department of Homeland Security to look at the issue of trafficking and ways to explore enhancing our field's collaborative work within local communities as well as across the federal government. We know that many of you have been supporting survivors of trafficking and are deeply engaged in this effort on a community level. And we know that many of our grantees have also been serving and supporting victims of trafficking and their families for quite some time. We're looking to continue to help strengthen partnerships where we can and also build on complements to the work that you all have been leading for many years across communities. Our grantee, the National Resource Center, focused on the Asian and Pacific Islander community, the Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence, along with Casa de Esperanza, has been working for many years on this issue. Specifically, the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence has invested more than 10 years on educating advocates around the very complex needs, challenges, and social issues impacting survivors of human trafficking, and then helping local domestic violence programs think about their responses to this issue, as well as cultivating more culturally relevant and linguistically appropriate work. Over the past year alone, we've led trainings with regional offices and local domestic violence programs and also national webinars that have reached over 450 people. They're continuing to lead work on this in very innovative ways. Their website is a wealth of information, and we're pleased to have them here today to be able to share some of that expertise with you. In addition to supporting this work within local communities and offering training resources, the FIPSA program has partnered federally to also support the Federal Strategic Action Plan, which is looking more closely at ways to support trafficking responses within local communities and across federal government. We are committed to finding ways to bridge supports around multiple points of contact, to think about ways to enhance services that are more trauma-informed and culturally relevant, as well as appropriate for adults and children. And this webinar today is just one of the many examples that we have in us doing this work across government. So I want to thank you on behalf of my director, Mary Louise Kelly, as well as my colleagues for joining us this afternoon. You will hear more about the work that our grantees are leading in the community, and we're hoping to hear from you about ways that we can continue to support your work on the ground. I will now like to pass the floor to my colleague, Mary Atlas Terry from the Office of Victims of Crime, who will also offer some welcoming remarks today. Mary?
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Shondell. Yeah, this is Mary Atlas Terry. I work at the Office for Victims of Crime, which is within the Department of Justice. And as many of you know, the Office for Victims of Crime is tasked with administering federal funding that supports crime victim services across the United States and in the territories. And one of our biggest areas of funding is VOCA funding, Victims of Crime Act funding, which supports all crime victims, but many of you may be sub-grantees or sub-providers under the VOCA formula grant in each of your states. And you may be providing direct services for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, families after homicide, and so it's just great to work with the FIPSA program staff to make sure that, you know, between the VOCA service providers and other OVC grantees and all of the FIPSA and HHS grantees, that we're kind of working collaboratively to try to get a unified messages out to the field and really try to leverage our federal resources better so that we can really build capacity in the field. So I'm just really happy to talk to you today. The Office for Victims of Crime also administers a very much smaller pot of money that was appropriated to the Department of Justice through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And that's where we administer a few smaller grant programs specifically for victims of human trafficking. One is the Services for Victims of Human Trafficking program, and the other is the Enhanced Collaborative Model to Combat Human Trafficking. And all of that information about the different grant programs is on our website, which is listed in your resources section of this PowerPoint. But it's basically www.ovc.gov. But we're just thrilled to partner with FIPSA on this because we just, in alignment with the Federal Strategic Action Plan, we really want to work across all the federal agencies to improve understanding about human trafficking and to really just improve outcomes and build capacity of everyone in the field to identify and serve victims. So thank you for having us today, and thank you to FIPSA for allowing and supporting this partnership.
Thank you, Mary. I now have the esteemed pleasure of being able to introduce our two speakers that we have today. Both Chick Dabby and Cindy have led some significant work within local communities around the issues of domestic violence, culturally specific responses, enhanced legal services, enhanced advocacy services, as well as thinking about the issue of trafficking and how to improve our work. Our first speaker is Chick Dabby. She is the Executive Director of the Asian and Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence. She has more than 30 years of experience in looking at ways to support domestic violence survivors, both adults and children, across communities and across different settings. Chick has a tremendous amount of expertise to share with us related to not only trafficking, but thinking about language access planning, the cultural relevance of services within mainstream programs, as well as within Asian and Pacific Islander communities, as well as challenging us all to think more about how we could work across the lifespan to address the issues related to trauma and abuse. And then following Chick, Cindy Liu will also be speaking, and she is the attorney of the Asian and Pacific Islander Legal Outreach Center, and they are a grantee of the Office of Victims of Crime. And Cindy has been practicing law in the areas of human trafficking, immigration, and family law and domestic violence for several years. She's currently the Director of Human Trafficking Project at the agency, and she also has worked on several litigation cases on behalf of trafficking survivors, and she's been the recipient of several awards in San Francisco related to human trafficking. I'd now like to pass the floor to Chick.
Thank you. This is Chick Dabby, and Cindy and I will be presenting an integrated set of points. so as we switch off, we'll say who's speaking. So I'm Chick Dabby. I want to thank Shondell and Mary and the FIPSA office for all the work and the funding that we get. So it's an honor to present to all of you and to be a FIPSA grantee. And of course, it is an honor to work with advocates in community-based organizations and also with federal agencies. So we're having slight technical problems at our end. Cindy, do you want to just introduce yourself, say hello?
Hi, this is Cindy, and I also do want to thank Mary and Shondell in inviting me to participate in this webinar. And we are indeed an OVC grantee and also sub-grantee of HHS, and it is we really greatly appreciate the support that we receive to be able to support trafficking survivors out here in the Bay Area. And it's great to be part of a network of so many passionate advocates.
So this is Chick. Just a word about the API Institute on Domestic Violence. We're a national resource center that's funded by FIPSA to provide technical assistance on and training on critical issues around violence affecting mainly Asian populations, but a lot of our work extends to all groups, especially, of course, our work on trafficking. You see the learning objectives in front of you, and then in terms of the way the PowerPoint will be organized, we first have a lot of material to go through, so we're going to be going way over the speed limit as we talk, and we will be referencing, our hesitations are because of the technical difficulties we're having. So we will be, so this is how the PowerPoint and the presentations by Cindy and me will be organized. We will be talking both about international trafficking and trafficking that occurs in the U.S., both, of course, involving adults and children, and sex and labor trafficking. And there'll be three themes throughout the slides that we want you to keep thinking about and how they affect your work. And we, of course, encourage you to participate through the chat. The three themes are survivor-centered advocacy, trauma-informed care, and, of course, collaboration. As we all know, that working on trafficking cases and issues requires a lot of collaboration. And on the point of collaboration, I just want to say that for all of us working in advocacy, it's really important point here that the Federal Strategic Action Plan on Services for Victims of Human Trafficking has been released. It's a 5-year plan which really details the way different federal agencies will be participating, and our role as advocates is to also join in that collaboration and bring the client survivor-centered, trauma-informed approach to that work. As a point of privilege, I just want to say that over many years of the work, given the work that we've done at the API Institute on Domestic Violence, it's really many Asian domestic violence programs have pioneered services for victims of trafficking. And so our work is really inspired by the work that advocates do on the ground. So we start with the basics and the definition of trafficking. Cindy?
Hi, this is Cindy, and I am an attorney, and most of my experience is largely based on working with cases. And so for me, oftentimes something that I go back to is just to understand the basic definition of trafficking under U.S. law. So the acronym TVPA there stands for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000, and this is federal law. Most states also at this point in time have different versions of their state trafficking laws and definitions, but many of them do track the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act legal definition. So it is worthwhile to know this definition, but also know what your local definitions are as well. Under the TVPA, there are mostly, it can be categorized into 3 main categories, and there's 2 here listed, and it's grouped this way as in terms of a legal definition of how trafficking occurs. And so for adult sex and labor trafficking cases and labor trafficking cases involving minors under the age of 18. Usually we're looking at different forms of action, so recruiting or harboring or moving or obtaining through the use of force or fraud or coercion for the purposes of these different forms of anti-slavery and related laws that have existed in U.S. Definitions. Do note that movement is not a requirement for trafficking. That's a huge misconception because oftentimes we think of arms or guns trafficking, but movement is a potential form of action, but it's or. And that trafficking is force or fraud or coercion, and that coercion can mean not only physical force, but psychological means of subjecting people to different forms of slave-like conditions. And that's the basic definition here in the U.S. Also, the third category under the TVPA and in many state laws is that if you are subjected to sex trafficking and you are a minor under the age of 18, the process and means is reduced to just inducing minor, which is a very basic definition just to entice them in some ways for some purposes of any type of commercial sex act. And oftentimes that can be anything, not just money as we think of normally in different forms of sex work and prostitution, but it could be exchanged for drug, food, shelter, higher status in a gang, for example. So these are generally the three main types of categories.
This is Chick. So as we saw that the definitions in the TVPA, and because they reference commercial sexual exploitation of children, we just wanted to point out the formal definition of what commercial sexual exploitation means. As we talk about the trafficking of minors, there are these two terms that sometimes used interchangeably, CSEC, which refers to commercial sexual exploitation of children, or DMST, which is domestic minor sex trafficking. There are some differences in this, but these are just general terms that are used in the field. So here's your definition of commercial sexual exploitation. And then this definition basically summarizes the points that Cindy made. And it also, on this slide, shows the difference that there is a distinction between trafficking and human smuggling. Mostly, human smuggling involves the transportation of individuals for a fee across borders. And the relationship ends after the transfer over the border. I just want to say, sometimes the human smugglers may connect up the clients they're crossing to traffickers, so they may be connected to a network of traffickers. But human smuggling occurs a lot in conflict zones. It's been the Underground Railroad for many Jews and other groups escaping the Nazis in Europe. So human smugglers, have been transporting individuals across borders for a long time for various different, because of various push factors. So just the 4 Ps of the TVPA, the 4 Ps of trafficking are.
This is Cindy. So they are protection, prosecution, and prevention. And in recent times, we've been also adding and talking about partnership, which is why we always talk about, you'll see these cases involve multi-agencies and disciplines. And to keep these 4 Ps in mind when addressing the issue of how to combat trafficking, how to serve survivors, that we really need a multi-pronged approach to this issue.
Okay. Next slide. If we look at worldwide statistics, we see that forced labor and exploitation is, of course, the largest group of individuals who are trafficked. If we look at some U.S. statistics, these are estimated statistics. It's very hard to get really accurate data yet. And so for international trafficking, here are the estimates of who comes into the U.S., 14,500 to 17,500. And in terms of minors, 12 to 14-year-old girls and 11 to 13-year-old boys are targeted for commercial sexual exploitation. The estimates are that 100 to 300,000 children per year are at risk. So that's not who's recruited or trapped, but they are at risk for commercial sexual exploitation. And I think a very telling statistic is that out of the runaways in the country, only 1/3 of runaways are reported as missing by parents. So that tells us a lot about what the home environment for runaways is. A last estimate here is that the estimated average age of entry into prostitution in the U.S. is 12, and this is because of the rise in minor sex trafficking and commercial trafficking. Next slide, if you just note the figures here I want to draw your attention to is the OVC figures. There are 1,300 new victims identified and served in 2012. And there were 674 T visas granted. Of course, the quota for T visas annually is 5,000. So this is a remedy that's available to many of us as advocates who work with clients and survivors. In San Francisco, Cindy?
This is Cindy. So in San Francisco, this is just a very brief snapshot of our clients, and it's really meant to represent the fact that our clients really do come from all over the world, including within the United States, but from also countries that you may not expect or think would be host countries for trafficking, such as South Korea as well. The type of trafficking, we see all sorts of trafficking. The age range is from someone as young as 7, but also we often forget that elderly survivors are also very much at risk of being vulnerable to being exploited and trafficked, sometimes by their own children. And our clients do come from all different types of gender identities and sexual orientations as well. And this is just in the Bay Area alone, but to keep and think broadly that probably this range of profiles of trafficking survivors probably exists in your area, and it's a question of identifying and reaching out to different communities to offer services and identify potential trafficking survivors.
Next slide. We have a polling question now, so if you can take a look at the poll. The question is, have you become aware of labor trafficking cases through your work, through your community, both, or none of the above? Okay.
All right, as people respond, I see that there's kind of an equal number of C, both, and A, through your work. Oh, things are happening. Looks like most people are both, 40%. And 15% is B, none of the other 11% is B, through your community. So it's kind of, so it's mostly through your work or both with your community.
So obviously there's a pretty high level of awareness about labor trafficking. Let's go to the next polling question. Next slide. In which of the following settings do you see the most labor trafficking? So you have to just pick one setting: agricultural or agribusiness, in the hospitality industry, hotels, food service, etc., in domestic work, which includes cleaning and caregiving, or in factory work. So if you can answer one of those.
Oh, wow, there was a majority of A, agriculture, but now it looks like it's mostly C, domestic work and cleaning and caregiving, with 22% saying hospitality and 9% saying factory work. All right. Domestic work is still in the lead.
Okay. So, Cindy, sample trafficking cases you've seen?
Yes, so these are, as you can see from the poll, these are all cases that we've seen here just in the Bay Area. This is a very small idea of what it looks like, because questions to think about in terms of trends of different types of trafficking that are happening in your area depends on the type of industries that are in your area, who are the different communities and populations in your area, and what type of work do they typically do. So, for example, obviously here in San Francisco, we are near a port, so we have also been seeing trafficking cases in the fishing industry as well. Tracking different forms of migration patterns is helpful in movement, not only across countries but across state lines and county borders when thinking about where the trafficking is occurring and in what industry. Sometimes it's not always an industry. We're also seeing increasing cases where individuals are being brought in by spouses to not only do domestic work, but to work in also the family-owned restaurant businesses. So these trends and these different sample human trafficking cases are something to keep in mind, to keep a broad mind about where trafficking occurs. If you're on the border states example as well, lately we've been seeing a sharp increase of forced drug smuggling and sales cases as well. So just keep those in mind.
Next slide.
And the other question often is, who are the traffickers? And this is something to think about in terms of trends. Not only who are the potential victims in a case, but who are the people who are recruiting and obtaining and moving these potential individuals. Oftentimes we see traffickers be members of someone's own community. They could be related to the victim through immediate or extended familial ties. Maybe they actually have high status in the community because they've been successful or they're well known in a gang community. They may also be locally and internationally organized criminal syndicates. This is sometimes, not always. Sometimes this occurs in the forms of street gangs or the MS-13 or drug cartels. And some of them are organized crime who are involved with other forms of organized criminal activity. As Chick mentioned earlier, many of the drug cartels who are involved in drug smuggling are also now involved in human smuggling and trafficking, and much of this goes on simultaneously. Although, however, sometimes traffickers really can be anyone. They could be independently owned businesses. We've had cases involving judges, prosecutors, diplomats, but also sometimes large third-party labor recruiters, so something that seems like an employment agency. So again, it's important to keep an open mind thinking about the breadth of trafficking cases and not only the profiles of the survivors and victims, but also the traffickers.
And feel free to add other types of traffickers you've seen in your areas into the chat box. So we move now from talking about the basics to talking about an analysis and considering some of the root causes of trafficking and the intersections between other forms of violence that we work with. So I want to start just by emphasizing a little bit, looking at the global picture in general. And trafficking relies on the exploitation of poverty, particularly female poverty. It also relies on creating systems of indebtedness, so families become indebted and cannot get out of debt, so they resort to trafficking, or that's the hold that the traffickers have on them. There are also complex push and pull factors that drive trafficking. Some of the push factors refers to conditions in sending countries that push people out. So, for example, the push factors, the most significant push factor is often poverty, and the pull factor could be that there would be jobs available here in the arriving country, in the receiving country. There would be enough to earn to repatriate and support a family. War and disasters are also push factors, and there's often a lot of devastation locally and regionally in conflict zones. So the pull factor might be able to find some work, and also, of course, safety. And similarly, abusive families and gangs, so conditions in the home can be a push factor, and there can be the pull factor is safety. If you can think of other push or pull factors based on the work you've done and the survivors you've served, please put those into the chat box as well. So we look at the root causes of sex trafficking, and I'm sorry, I wanted to go back. I didn't finish so back to the slide 21. So the other root causes of trafficking are demands for cheap and exploitable labor in globalized markets. So if we think of globalization as the free movement of capital, but not the free movement of labor, that's why you have these trends where labor is trying to move to where the jobs are and where capital is being invested. And related to that analysis, some countries view trafficking as the only form of migration available to labor because all other approaches are closed or restricted. And so those advocates claim that safe migration would prevent trafficking. So now at the root causes of sex trafficking. The first most significant one I want to emphasize is the culture of gender violence and the devaluation that normalizes the abuse of women and girls and the rejection of LGBTQ youth and individuals. So it's a big player. We all operate, when we talk about culture, we generally think about ethnic culture, but we actually operate in the culture of violence, and that is normalized, and those are some of the effects. One of the other root causes, male demands for commodified sex, also drives trafficking. Trafficking relies on the extent of the male demand. There are some estimates here that if 100,000 minors are recruited into sex trafficking and they're turning a minimum of 10 tricks a day, then you have 1 million male buyers per year. So we have to ask, where did these male buyers come from, and what is this culture of gender oppression that we then are surrounded by. The other thing, of course, male demands also depend on trends. So there are trends to have sex with younger and younger girls, so pimps can get higher prices for younger girls, and so that also drives, that also then refers to the male demands for commodified sex. Predation and impunity, there's a real nexus of male predatory behavior, and this is seen as normal part of masculinity. And of course, there's money. There's a lot of money in sex trafficking and in human trafficking, and there are less penalties and less dangers associated with it. So just some of the dynamics of domestic minor sex trafficking in the U.S. In the previous example, in an analysis of root causes, I talked about the exploitation of poverty, but here we see an exploitation of vulnerability. And the vulnerability comes from all kinds of arenas, of course, but it's really driven by abuse, neglect, and devaluation, which then, of course, increases youth vulnerability to predation on the streets, etc. And there's also, of course, an exploitation of male vulnerability, but it's not only confined to men who are homosexual and boys who are homosexual, but also due to abuse. In domestic minor sex trafficking, there are 4 types of trafficking, and therefore 4 different dynamics of control. There's pimp-controlled trafficking, where where teens and young adults are targeted and recruited, and there's a whole process of targeting, recruiting, grooming them, and turning them out. So they're not immediately pressed into trafficking, but there's a lot of grooming that goes on by the pimp before they're turned out to turn tricks. There's family control trafficking, which often has dynamics of incest and sexual abuse, trading young victims, young children amongst other families, and buying and selling of children. Gang control trafficking is, by all accounts, has a large element of violence in it as well, and girls are also recruiting girls into gangs, and there's blackmail and threats connected to that, which can be, of course, connected to any other forms of control, trafficking. And then the last form is trans control trafficking, where trans and gay, straight and gay boys are trafficked by trans men. So, next slide. We have a poll here. Have you become aware of sex trafficking cases through your work, through your community, both, or none of the above? So now we're getting some data.
Okay, it looks like we have 65% indicating C, both through your work and through your community. A much smaller 33% indicating through work, and much smaller percentages indicating B through community, and D, none of these. So majority is both through community and through work.
Okay. And then we have another polling question. What are the most prevalent types of sex trafficking cases you are aware of? Sex trafficking of adults, of minors, or a mix of both?
Okay. So this is a A, B, and C multiple choice question, and it looks like B has 44%, followed by a mix of both, C, 67% right now, and that number is growing. All right, it looks like the majority is C, a mix.
Right. So the next slide, we would go to Cindy, the intersections of abuse.
This is Cindy. So in kind of conversation earlier when we were talking about sex trafficking, particularly in the forms of commercial sex trafficking involving commercial sex acts, oftentimes I think many people are familiar with the conversation that domestic violence and sexual assault are very much intertwined and connected with those types of cases. But here let's talk about a case where there are these intersections of abuse and violence in Melinda's story. So Melinda, fearing that her abusive husband would kill her, entered the United States by land with the hope of applying for asylum. She was caught at the border and was released on bond to Washington State, where she had friends. She was kidnapped 3 months later, held hostage at gunpoint, and raped many times by her kidnapper. Her kidnapper forced her to harvest apples for over 10 hours a day for 2 months and took all of her money. So in this case, we see the intersections of trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. But in the case where she's leaving her country because of violent domestic violence, where presumably the government or the police are not helping her, she's kidnapped and sexually assaulted by her trafficker and kidnapper, but also forced to work and trafficked in that sense by being forced to harvest apples. So again, this is based off of a true case of mine, where we see these intersections of violence among these different arenas in both sex and labor trafficking, and that it's very possible, whether or not your client or the person you're coming in contact with is coming from abroad, an immigrant, or here within the United States. And so these intersections can be thought of in many different ways in intersecting case examples. So aside from intersecting trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault, we could replace many of these circles with trafficking with human trafficking, child abuse, elder abuse, so on and so forth. Going further in terms of these intersecting oppressions, we've kind of talked about this. I do want those who work with domestic violence survivors to expand their mind in terms of thinking about the intersections of trafficking and domestic violence. And that, again, I mentioned earlier, lately we've been seeing many cases where people are brought in through the form of marriage to be domestic workers, and that these different forms of violence can either lead and push someone into trafficking, it can follow, it can be simultaneous, and that it's important to recognize how this affects the survivors that we work with.
Next slide.
Next slide. This is also an intersecting circle. I really like Venn diagrams, as you can see, between trafficking, prostitution, and smuggling. Now, we've gone over some of these definitions, but the legal clarity is important and is important for us to understand. So trafficking, again, is a human rights violation. That definition is listed there. Smuggling is an unauthorized entry of a non-citizen into a country. It's a violation of your country's border laws. And prostitution, this is just an example from the California Penal Code, is a violation of some type of vice law. It's a description of something that's happening that's technically illegal under the law. So one thing to point out here is the definition of trafficking recognizes the person who's been subjected to it as a victim of trafficking, whereas both the legal definitions of prostitution and smuggling treat the person who is being subjected or in the situation as a perpetrator and as a person who is violating laws and is a criminal. And this is important to think about because when you're coming into contact with a trafficking survivor, it depends on which legal lens you're looking at this person. And if you're not looking at this person from the trafficking perspective, it's very easy to see why trafficking survivors could be easily deported or arrested or treated as criminals instead of as victims and survivors who deserve and need services.
Okay. Next slide.
This is it's a modified power control wheel for those of you who are familiar with something similar in the domestic violence world, but this was developed by the Polaris Project just to show that many of the similar barriers to seeking services and the ways that traffickers use power and control can be similar in both sex and labor trafficking, and that oftentimes it's important to know somewhat the difference between sex and labor trafficking, but to know that these forms of control and barriers can be very similar and intersected.
Okay. Next slide. We have a polling question. So based on your work in your community, or based on your work or in your community, in which setting is sex trafficking most prevalent? massage parlors, street, brothel, hotel or motel. So if you can take the poll, please. I know many of us are having some technical difficulties, so I apologize about that. Okay, we're going to have to keep going because we're not getting the poll results, not showing up yet. Next slide. So now we go to the next section, which is on trauma-informed advocacy. And as you know, there's been a lot of buzz around looking at trauma-informed care. And so this is Chick, so I'll be defining what that refers to, and then we can broaden our understanding of trauma-informed care. So next, so if we go to trauma, so the slide that starts by saying trauma is, so that's, trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, or in other words, emotional shock because of catastrophic events, physical injuries, threats of harm, acts of violence, dislocation, and loss of home, family, country, and children. Next, trauma compromises many aspects of our lives. So, of course, it compromises our health. Back to, my apologies. So I just talked about the different kinds of situations that cause trauma. And then the next slide is about our understanding of trauma. So understanding of trauma is really expanded from just narrowly being seen as PTSD, where it was really event-related, and that if you removed people from the event, then you kind of found a way to manage the trauma. But even our understanding of PTSD has grown to see the long-term effects of that kind of exposure to traumatic events. There's also chronic trauma, which is repetitive, prolonged trauma, like being in a trafficking situation or being sexually abused over time at home. There's historical trauma, which is intergenerational, trauma due to historical oppression. We all can have histories of oppression based on our identity or our ethnicity. In this country, of course, Native Americans have a very large history of oppression, historical oppression that affects their lives. There's trauma that's community, cultural, or systems-inflicted trauma. And there's also so many systems, because they were that have been designed to help victims and survivors, sometimes end up not being helpful and act as barriers to services. So there's also systems-related trauma, and that means that we have to pay attention to the culture of systems and how we make them trauma-informed. Insidious trauma refers to daily micro-experiences that keep adding up, racial profiling, driving while black, not getting served where you go somewhere. And then secondary or vicarious trauma is a term that's increasingly familiar for those who work with trauma survivors and trauma victims, and that we're exposed to trauma by listening to other people's experiences. So what is trauma-informed care? Next slide. Oops, all right. So the trauma can compromise health, which is shown by the adverse childhood experience studies. Mental health issues are, of course, severely impacted when there's a history of trauma. In one study, severe childhood maltreatment increased threefold the likelihood of adult psychosis. The brain chemistry and architecture is altered. Coping strategies are compromised, and people might turn to substance abuse in order to cope with trauma and pain. The ability to heal is compromised. Cognitive development and learning ability suffer. Attachment suffers. There's especially maternal-child bonds can be compromised and severed, and so they need to be reestablished. Sexual pleasure is affected. How we relate to our bodies and how we feel about our bodies is affected by trauma, especially sexual violence trauma, and a sense of self, acculturation, and belonging. Next slide. So now we're talking about trauma-informed advocacy and what that means. So trauma-informed advocacy is not the same as trauma-specific interventions. So trauma-informed advocacy involves having a basic knowledge of trauma and its impact, understanding what triggers there might be, what might trigger people's trauma, both of the people we serve and work with, as well as our own. And that understanding then can help minimize re-victimization. So for example, if we make the usual statements that we make about confidentiality, that whatever you tell me here doesn't go out of the room, it stays here, no one else needs to know we're talking or meeting, etc., that might trigger somebody who was a victim of childhood sexual assault because the perpetrator would have said the same things. This stays in the room, nobody needs to know. So if we can understand that when we're doing something as formal as providing a confidentiality statement that we think is reassuring, it actually might trigger somebody. So it helps us understand that dynamic, and it also helps them, the client or the survivor, understand that dynamic, that's why they're being triggered. So it's about providing trauma-informed lens, is about providing information to about trauma to victims. It's about helping survivors manage their feelings, feel in control of situations, and give input on program services. So one example, I was recently at a shelter, and one of the procedures they follow in the shelter is every Friday all the shelter residents can give a list to the shelter manager about all the foods they want to have for the following week. So why is that trauma-informed? Well, it's trauma-informed because it takes into account the fact that then women feel they're in an environment where things are predictable, where things are reliable, where they can give input, they can ask for what they want, and they can get that. So they're in control, there's predictability, and those kinds of things then create this environment that we're trying to establish of emotional safety for victims and staff. Philosophically, I think a very good guiding question, rather than asking what has happened to you, rather than asking what's wrong with you, is how we think about what has happened to you, what are the harms that have been done to you. And that then changes the framework of how we approach survivors and victims, and it changes how they can receive the care and support and the advocacy and empowerment that we offer. Next slide. Tying into this question of what has happened to you, one of the things we know that happens a lot is violence over the life course. And at the API Institute, we developed the lifetime spiral of gender violence, which is shown on the next slide. You're not expected to try and read all the different items on there, but basically what we're trying to show is that there are different types of violence that occur at different life stages for infants, children, teenagers, young adults, and elders. And the lifetime spiral then shows that gender-based violence is historical and structural. It's not accidental. It's not just about being in the wrong place at the wrong time or having bad luck. And by the time many folks come to our programs, they have these histories of abuse, and they also have histories of help-seeking behavior. So I want to just make a point that as we as advocates, when we talk about victimization and we talk about abuse, etc., these are not terms that many victims themselves, that this vocabulary may not be meaningful to victims and survivors. So for example, asking somebody if they've been sexually abused, if that person has been sexually abused since age 4, they don't even know what sex is. And they're not going to make that connection of this is sexual abuse. So what vocabulary of victimization we use, we have to be really careful and how we use it, and that's part of being trauma-informed. The other part of being trauma-informed is understanding help-seeking behavior. And help-seeking behavior, there's a lot of anecdotal and some research evidence to show that help-seeking behavior in the present is affected and influenced by past attempts. So just in general, if there's a lot of victim blaming, and you go to get help from somebody who blames you, then you're not going to go to that person for help. So if you're being raped, molested at the age of 8 by somebody in the home, and you tell your mother and she doesn't believe you, when that molester starts raping you, you will probably not go back to that family member to tell them about the abuse. So again, by the time survivors are in our programs or in our offices or in any sort of service setting, not only do they have histories of abuse, they also have histories of help seeking, and many times those are negative histories of help seeking. So our work with them establishes that there's going to be, the trauma-informed part is understanding that they may have those negative histories of help seeking, and we can make that change. Next slide. So just very briefly, here are some examples of the considerations for complex trauma and oppression that many survivors face. And I just point to the one about groups of survivors. So in trafficking, there are often large groups of survivors that are trafficked together in a group, and these individuals will have different kinds of different degrees of loyalty, attachment, sexual jealousy to the traffickers and the pimps, because they do have some connection to them. So in terms of working, in terms of our work with them, they may appear as hostile witnesses, and there might be intergroup rivalries as well. So one of the women may have been the favorite of one of the more powerful traffickers. So those intergroup rivalries, etc., get played out, and we only see this as sort of survivors not taking the services we're offering well enough, etc. So what I want to explain here is that we need to be careful from our trauma-informed approach. We may, again, reach for the vocabulary of victimization that we're familiar with and sort of refer to it as, is this Stockholm Syndrome, where the victims are identifying with the survivor. But it's very subtle, and we need to understand and learn from survivors. So I remember one young girl telling me, I don't like that I have to work 14 hours a day, and that my trafficker forces me to do that, but at least my trafficker brought me here and took me out of the extremely abusive situation in my home and in my village. Another aspect, next slide. So if we look at the last bullet, I want to draw your attention to that, where the trauma of trafficking is pretty severe for in domestic minor sex trafficking and for children. So in addition to sexual abuse, neglect, etc., these are children who haven't actually been parented either. So that's part of the effect of trauma. And so for many young minor trafficked victims, not only do they need trauma-informed care, but also trauma-specific interventions to promote healing. One of the ways that we think about survivor-centered trauma-informed advocacy is thinking about the way we approach asking questions. We all, of course, know the difference between interviewing somebody and interrogating them. And even in our interviews, as we try to gather data, using a trauma-informed lens, if we ask somebody, tell me just about the rape, or tell me what happened the first time you were turned out by a pimp, then that person can get stuck in that memory and get flooded or have, traumatic memories about that situation. We can also start from a position of understanding their strength and asking them, so tell me about the moment you knew you'd survive, or you knew you'd escape, or you knew you'd get out. And that then brings somebody to a different starting point for their narrative of abuse. So now we go to points of contact. Cindy, were there any other points you wanted to clarify in the trauma-informed aspects?
No, just I think particularly your point earlier about labels and terminology. It's really important when working with different communities, and that I think that that a lot of terminology such as prostitute, sex slave, illegal, different various forms of this do create barriers from people feeling that they can come seek help, and that's very, very important.
Yeah, and the other thing about those labels, even just calling somebody trafficked, is that then once they're out of that situation, they're still always labeled as trafficked. And in the community, that can mean that they knowingly entered, say, into a fraudulent marriage, or they participated in this without understanding the victimization piece. So I think that given the community's attitudes towards victim blaming or systems' attitudes to victim blaming, we have to be careful how these labels then live on after people are even out of the situation. So now we go to points of contact, slide 43. And we want to just raise some general issues and then go through the different points of contact to try and draw your attention to some considerations and recommendations. Again, I want to really give props to the Federal Strategic Action Plan, which clearly places victim-centered, culturally relevant, gender-responsive, trauma-informed work at the core of advocacy for anti-trafficking efforts. So
oftentimes, this is Cindy, what Chick was talking about earlier is very relevant when we're talking about trauma and help-seeking behavior in terms of how do you identify trafficking survivors. So oftentimes we hear people say, well, I'm being told that trafficking is a big problem in my community. I see the statistics, but we're doing outreach. We're just, where are the victims? Where are the survivors? So in terms of screening and identifying survivors, we do have to take those considerations of trauma and help-seeking behavior into account. This is not a perfect checklist of identifying someone who may be trafficked. They may come in various forms. Sometimes they have a heightened sense of fear. Sometimes it's the complete opposite. They may have a complete flat affect. But I think rather than the goal always being, I need to identify perfectly whether or not this person fits in the definition of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Are they a trafficking victim? I think the real goal is to think about, does this person need help? Do they need services? Is there a referral that can be provided, rather than trying to perfectly identify the case from the get-go? And oftentimes your contact with the survivor can be very brief, and it is a short window of time where you're not going to be able to ask this exhaustive list. There are definite usual red flags, though. Someone controlling someone's identity documents, travel restrictions, any form of evidence of abuse, whether it's physical, mental, or sexual. Living at a workplace with their employer is a common thing as well. And I think this short kind of list, again, not a perfect checklist, is to really trigger you to think about where are the points of contact in your community and where you are, where you might come into contact with a trafficking survivor. So different people in different capacities are going to ask different questions in different ways, but maybe some of these are questions that you can add on to your existing screening protocols, whether it be in a medical setting, whether or not you're law enforcement, whether or not you're providing services for new mothers who are low income, whether or not you work in a religious place of worship. These are just a few things to consider. Slide, please.
Next.
So these are just other questions for potential trafficking survivors. Some of them that are specific to trafficking sometimes can include this concept of debt. That is a very big issue in many of the trafficking cases that we do see. So deductions for the cost of smuggling, housing, food, sometimes charging for birth control pills. This can be very common. I do want to caution that oftentimes the isolation from community and restriction of movement is not always, we have this vision that trafficking survivors are being locked in the basement, attached to the radiator or something, and we have seen cases where people are locked in, but sometimes trafficking survivors are restricted in their freedom of movement or in what's happening in their situation due to just general heightened sense of fear, or someone has told them, if you leave the house, you'll get deported or arrested. It could be, sometimes in many of our cases, people are not given keys, so that they are fearful that if they leave the place that they'll be homeless. And it could be other questions that I like to ask, just to get a sense of how this person is just living on a daily basis. Where do you sleep? In many of my domestic worker cases, many of the clients sleep in a closet in the spare bedroom for really no good reason other than the fact that it is a subjection of someone's will. It's an assertion of control and position of power over somebody. So those are questions to ask as well, rather than focusing just on were you paid at all, which can be important, but none of these, again, are million-dollar questions to say, aha, this is a trafficking survivor.
This is Chick. I just want to raise the point that you made about debt, Cindy. So once somebody is, picked up in a raid or arrested and so on, and they're no longer able to earn the money they were earning, then that inability to then repatriate the funds home or support the family members or pay off the debt that they owe to the traffickers and all the threats that are contained in that also becomes a source of trauma. So the trauma-informed piece is not that they just lost some income that they were, spending frivolously, but understanding that the inability to support the family back home or whatever the reason for whoever is relying on those funds is an important source of trauma for victims.
I think that's a great point because in the U.S. it's acceptable in some ways, the idea of being in debt, whereas for a lot of our clients who come from abroad, I've asked someone once, well, what happens when the debt collector comes around? He said, well, he comes around with a machete or he goes after your family. So the idea of fear and danger surrounding debt is very different, and also in many of our other cases, particularly in some of the massage parlor cases we work on with API women, there was a constant repetition of this concept of the commitment to pay off the debt, and that it was part of also your identity and responsibility to your community and society, even though for a while some people didn't understand that as a cultural concept.
Okay. So we're going to go to the issue of endangerment and confidentiality. And in general, we really want to emphasize that there's a different level of endangerment that comes with trafficking cases compared to cases we work on around sexual violence or domestic violence, where there's a single victim and a single perpetrator most often. And so here the perpetrators might be people who have connections to gangs, they're part of a trafficking ring, they're part of a criminal ring, so there are very different levels of endangerment, and it's important to consider those issues in the work. So we want to just draw your attention to that, and that makes the collaboration all the more critical, so that there aren't breaches of confidentiality, there aren't misunderstandings or failed expectations, because of lack of communication across systems. So we're inviting you to say things in the chat, but the chat isn't working very well, so we'll go to the next. So if your chat is working, you can tell us about some of the points of contact you might see in your work. So the first point of contact can often be raids.
So one variety of this is Cindy, is raids, otherwise sometimes known as sting operations. Basically, it's when someone is usually forcibly entering a certain location, and there are considerations for this. Sometimes it can often create access points to a group of people who otherwise are being shut off from the outside world, but other times there are trauma considerations for this because it can be very scary for people. They don't know when, oftentimes it's law enforcement, but sometimes it could be civil or criminal who are coming in, whether or not they're the ones who are in trouble, if they're going to be the ones who are arrested. And many of them often at that point in time decide to repatriate immediately, either abroad or back to the pimp or the trafficker and reunite with them because they are scared and they've been warned and coached that this might happen, and it kind of oftentimes makes their fears come true that they are going to get in trouble. Sometimes from these situations we have been able to identify successfully certain victims of trafficking, but the situation can be very difficult because oftentimes they are group situations, and by group I can mean anywhere between 3, 4 to 120 people that we've worked on in cases. And as Chick mentioned earlier, this can create a lot of other stresses that need to be worked on in advance when you're working with different agencies to discuss, well, if you're having all of a sudden 120 people, where are they going to be housed? Who are actually the survivors in this case? Who is maybe middle management? Who are the traffickers? What is the dynamic between them? And what are we going to do? What language needs do they need? So these are questions to think and work about in advance over and over again that can change in every single different kind of scenario.
And I've heard a young trafficked survivor say, you know, I'm a 9-year-old dressed like an 18-year-old, and I don't have any clothes, and it's freezing cold. And so I'm sitting being questioned or interviewed. I need some clothing. So we need to think about those pieces, and that can be part of the collaboration. So even if your local law enforcement is planning a raid or you collaborate with them, then those are some of the issues you can bring to the table. You know, will there be a way? Is it happening in winter, summer? You know, just like paying attention to victims' needs in addition to the system's needs to get the information from them. The next point of contact is arrest. So most of the advocacy work around trafficking, of course, has initially been to make sure that arrested individuals are seen as victims and not criminals. And that's where there's got to be a lot of careful sort of sorting out of who are the victims and who might be the traffickers. And sometimes, in terms of a recommendation, I just want to point to the one where when there are arrests or, you know, big publicized events, oftentimes programs encourage other victims to come forward, or the law enforcement might encourage other victims to come forward, but that really has to be coordinated properly with programs so that there's you know, proper language services available, there's advocates available to work with those victims, so that the victims understand that if they come forward to law enforcement, they're not just going to get arrested or sent somewhere that into a system that they don't understand. The next point of contact is custody and release. It's really important to know where the person is being held, so you can understand where and who they will be released to. And in terms of the recommendation, it's again clear that many times trafficked individuals can be released to the person, to their traffickers. You know, the traffickers come pick them up, set up bond, all those things. So that piece is really a critical point for intervention for advocates from community-based organizations, and again working very closely with law enforcement about the, you know, post-arrest or post-sting, what happens at release, and making sure it's into a safe setting. For many minor victims, they're very attached in domestic minor sex trafficking. They're very attached to their traffickers. They refer to their pimps as daddy or boyfriend. In trans controlled trafficking, many of the boys refer to their pimps as family members who are looking after them, in contrast to their biological family members who threw them out because of their sexual orientation. Next slide.
Sorry, can I just interject? This is Cindy, and I just want to recommend that if you have questions about safety planning and the complexities surrounding this, sometimes good people to talk to are those who run domestic violence shelters, confidential shelter programs, and to ask them what their protocols are, because I think oftentimes this issue of stalking someone, tracking them with GPS or et cetera, these considerations are taken to account to a certain degree with the cases that they work on, so it's just something to keep in mind.
So next is legal representation and intervention. And so just harking back to the previous point about custody and release, this is why it's important to know where people are being held and where they'll be released, so that you can go and be sure that you can represent them, because the traffickers will send their lawyers, and those lawyers will be representing the traffickers' interests, not the victims' interests, et cetera. So there's a larger section on legal remedies, but Cindy, did you want to just kind of point out to the conflict?
Just remember, for attorneys, for the victim service attorneys, if you're working on group cases, it's really important to talk it out with your case managers and law enforcement. The kind of protocols and systems in which you're going to be interviewing and vetting for trafficking survivors, because you could potentially end up talking to a trafficker or someone that we call middle management who works for the trafficker first, thereby conflicting you out of representing all the victims in the same case. So it's really helpful and important to kind of work out how your own legal obligations are in relation to your team.
Yeah, and in addition, I mean, to compromising the legal relationship, by not making that differentiation correctly, that's where also attorneys and advocates need to collaborate, because advocates could, of course, inadvertently work with all the members in the group. The trafficker or the mid-management person might be the quote auntie or mom, even, you know, who they came into the country under that. Under those identities, so you may think, oh, here's the mother, etc. But that's why how we sort out who is in the group, and sometimes advocates will also consider that the mid-manager or the traffic person is also a victim, and so we have to kind of work with all those different moving parts. Okay, for shelter. So next slide, and the next point, that can be one point of contact. Of course, it isn't for everybody. And what I want to emphasize here is the importance of collaboration. So in domestic violence cases, most of the systems involvement is limited, or it's not as expansive as it is with trafficking cases. So with trafficking cases, we're working with ICE, Homeland Security, FBI, Federal Prosecutor's Office, Victim Witness in the Federal Prosecutor's Office. So there are many systems players, and that can cause confusion and chaos within the programming. The other difference can be that trafficked residents in a shelter may not participate in all the programming that the DV survivors have to participate in. So that can create resentments within the shelter residents and within the staff at the shelter. So some of those issues need to be understood and from a trauma-informed perspective, so that we can have create that level of emotional safety in the shelter. Okay. Next is healthcare system. So just briefly running through a few kinds of problems that show up when we're looking at trafficked individuals. And there's some work being done now in the country to have healthcare professionals identify trafficked victims that are showing up in clinics and in their offices. I remember vividly an adult now saying, you know, I've been trafficked since I've been a victim of incest since I was 2, and then trafficked through family-controlled trafficking, and then followed by pimp-controlled trafficking. And, you know, saying that our bodies are not made to have sex at 2 or at 5 or at 9. And so it takes an immense toll, of course, psychologically and emotionally. So some of these are constellations of symptoms. One of the points I just want to show up here is the issue of branding. So for domestic minor sex trafficking, pimps sometimes resort to branding because they consider these girls and boys to be in their stable. UTIs or urinary tract infections for farm workers, because there aren't any toilets and people are holding and there's no sanitation. It can also result from sexual exploitation, of course. Another aspect I want to emphasize, next slide, is the issue of fight, flight, or freeze and exaggerated startle responses. So many of us are familiar with this notion that when we're traumatized or when there's something unexpected that happens, the body responds with fight or flight. But actually, as common is the response of freeze. And that often feeds into, if we don't understand that freeze, it's just where people don't know what to do and they're frozen, it gets narrated as victim blaming. Why didn't she do something? She could have escaped. She was there, so, etc. So I think we have to really understand that there's constellation of responses. And there might be skin rashes that farm workers get. And these, Cindy was saying, those can be like entered into evidence. And of course, multiple physical injuries. And traffic victims, international traffic victims, might have uncommon health problems when they show up here. On the gynecological level, there are many pieces, but for young women, it's also the persistent and repeated use of Depo-Provera so that they don't have their periods. and then that has a very long-term, devastating long-term effects on the body. So next slide, if we go to medical records, and there are many considerations about medical records. The point I want to make is that for minors, the issue is who owns the records, when, or even for other adult victims, if the federal prosecutor wants a report or wants a medical evaluation or psychological evaluation, does the report belong to the prosecutor who asked for it? Does it belong to all the attorneys? Who does it belong to? What does it mean to give informed consent if you don't speak the language well enough or you don't understand these procedures? Who gives consent for a minor when the parents are not there? The parents might themselves be the traffickers, etc. So a lot of these decisions about consent, file ownership, records, confidentiality are important, and it's really critical to have medical interpreters at all appointments. So now we go to legal remedies available to trafficked victims. Cindy?
So this is Cindy. Instead of giving complex legal jargon, which many lawyers like me are sometimes want to do, I have a more basic chart here, and this is legal remedies for potential trafficking survivors. And you can see that there are many different legal processes and systems in place. And one trafficking survivor at any point in time can be involved, and not just one, but maybe 4 or 3 of these systems, and each one of them can be completely overwhelming, traumatizing, but also empowering. So the question is, when you're thinking about legal remedies for trafficking survivors, is what kind of service and what does this legal remedy do for somebody? So for immigration work, oftentimes this is for benefits and status and stability. The goals for all these different legal processes are very different, and this is important when you're figuring out what process you're in, what that goal is for the survivor and how to explain that to them. And all of immigration work is federal, under federal law, so that's something to consider. Civil remedies, oftentimes we forget that many of our trafficking survivors do deserve monetary compensation for the work and labor that they have performed, and are oftentimes the evidentiary standard in criminal cases can be very high, but are lower in civil cases, and that civil lawsuits can be brought to support trafficking survivors, such as wage hour claims, tort contract claims. And this can really help a survivor rebuild a nest egg, figure out maybe where the next month's rent is going to be to pay off that debt they're worried about abroad, to support their children, which is why they're here in the first place. Another important thing is asserting the victim's rights in the criminal justice system, and there are both state and federal laws around these issues. But oftentimes it's to ensure that the trafficking survivor, as a victim and as a witness in a criminal case, is having their rights asserted. So these things could be their right to be protected from their trafficker. It could be the right to be present at all the hearings and sentencing hearings, the right to be heard to confirm with the prosecutor in the case, the right to give a victim impact statement to the judge to impact the sentencing, to request restitution. So these things are quite important as we are advocates to walk our clients through this process, which can also be overwhelming and traumatizing for them as well. In the family law system, juvenile system, dependency system, oftentimes these are under state law, and this is important to remember, again, as we talk about the intersections of domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking, so restraining orders. Sometimes someone simply needs a divorce from their trafficker. And for the juvenile and dependency systems, the goals of how to protect the minors, either if they're entering the system through illegal acts, or how to protect them and make sure that they're returning to a safe environment. So that's just a very, very broad, basic overview. Obviously, if you want specific legal training on these topics, that can be done, but this is, again, just a broad overview.
Next slide.
One thing to just highlight is the importance of immigration status for the concept of benefits for services. And there are, what was created under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Violence Against Women Act are certain remedies for trafficking survivors and also other survivors of violence as we see them intersecting. So this includes, as we've mentioned a few times, the T visa, the U visa. These two were created to not only support survivors to be able to get legal status to work and live here in the United States, but to assist them in being able to cooperate in a law enforcement investigation. The Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, has a self-petitioning process for those who are abused by U.S. citizen and legal permanent resident spouses, asylum for those who are persecuted and sometimes trafficked abroad, and special immigrant juvenile status for those who are minors and immigrants who have been abandoned and abused. So these are just different forms, again, thinking about one trafficking survivor can qualify for several of these things, but what we're really thinking about is you're encountering this person at this moment of time. What are the benefits and the legal remedies that you need to get to be able to help this person move past this specific point of what we call of being victimized in this particular circumstance? How do we help them reintegrate? How do we, when we talk about making future plans to go to school, to work, to reunify with their family, how do we make this possible? And this is often part of the conversation. For those who don't, oftentimes we also encounter trafficking survivors who have legal permanent resident status or are U.S. citizens. And it's not so much immigration status per se that's the major concern, but they have other legal concerns related to benefits for services. So in your state, particularly with those who are aging out of the foster care system, who many of these youth who are vulnerable now to being exploited, it's important to explore whether or not they also have extended benefits as well. So it's something to consider. In particular to immigration status, if you do qualify for a T visa or continued presence, a separate legal concept that law enforcement gives, you can qualify for 8 months of refugee benefits that the Department of Health and Human Services through the Office of Refugee and Resettlement provide. And much of this information will be included in some of the resources and is available online as well.
So in terms of the resources, indeed, you will be getting a whole list of resources that are sorted and categorized. And I just want to say we only have 5 minutes left. So we've obviously presented you with a lot of information. Unfortunately, because the chat hasn't been working, at least at our end, we're not going to able to get questions and respond to them. What I would like to say to offer on behalf of all of us, both OVC, PIPSA, Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, and the API Institute, that if you would like further presentations or further trainings on specific aspects of any of the work that we've presented today, we are TA providers and training providers, and we'd be happy to consider how that can be done. So if you wanted a webinar or for your agency or for programs in your city, etc., please feel free to contact us. Information for all of us is on the beginning slide and on the ending slide. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Shondell and Mary for any final thoughts.
Thank you, Cindy and Chick, for delivering such a tremendous amount of information in 90 minutes. We appreciated the thorough sort of walkthrough that you provided everyone. We do have a couple of questions. I did want to let everyone know that we will email out the PowerPoint again to those who did not receive it, and we will send the contact information for Nancy, so you can email her directly if you all did not get a copy and it was just sent out. We do have a couple questions here that we'd like to take a few minutes to ask before we wrap up. Mary?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, Chick and Cindy, if you could kind of just talk about some similarities between other victims of violent crime, domestic violence, sexual assault, and the needs of victims of human trafficking. So it's my understanding that no one organization can really comprehensively meet all of the variety of needs of a victim of human trafficking. So who do you really need to have in your network, in your Rolodex for strong referrals for services? Like what are some of the most frequently used and needed services that victims of human trafficking need to heal and kind of eventually meet their own goals for safety and becoming more self-sufficient?
This is Chick. So one aspect of that is, I think, Mary, your question shows up all the points of contact that people have, and I think connected to what I was saying about help-seeking behavior and how positive experiences of help-seeking and the advocacy work of making systems function as gateways to services, all these elements can come into play to connecting people up to different resources. There, of course, aren't many resources available, but it's growing, the number of resources, and I think the factor of collaboration then expands the kinds of resources that are available.
I think that's right, Chick, and I think that different type of trafficking cases and different communities will have different needs and need different forms of involvement. So one example is if your particular area, for example, here in the Bay Area, we have one of the largest Filipino communities outside of the Philippines, actually. So in working with that population, one of the first things that we do is to think about who are the community advocates within that community that we can really connect with to understand not only language needs, because we oftentimes think that language is sufficient for culture. And I think as Chick mentioned earlier, the culture what we talk about is also not just ethnicity or race, but can be things like youth culture or a culture around a certain religion. Talking to different communities who really understand what their community is like, what is the outreach message that's going to work for them. So for, again, predominantly Catholic-based communities, we sometimes don't use the word divorce when we're talking about encouraging people to come learn about their rights in family law or about domestic violence and violence that's happening in the family. So those are some considerations from the front end when we're talking about outreach, and to also make sure that any kind of outreach you do to the community is matched by the services that you're able to provide. So I think that that's something that's very common and similar when we're talking about service provision in all forms of victims of any kind of violence that we see. As you mentioned earlier, you're right, no one organization can comprehensively meet all sorts of these different types of needs, but that's because trends and different communities that are moving in are also evolving at a constant rate. So I think this is an exercise that we as community-based organizations also need to be doing frequently. And again, when we talked about points of contact, that's thinking who are oftentimes first responders in these cases. So that I think that's why Chick also really highlighted medical services. And oftentimes it can also be law enforcement, or it can be where do people first show up when they really need assistance. So kind of really thinking through those questions and then kind of helping people then formulate the additional questions to screen and then refer the cases. So I think, again, medical and also I think for therapy, counseling, these are common things. Oftentimes it's actually not legal services. We get a lot of referrals from community-based organizations because people are afraid to be involved with the legal system. So it's important for us as legal service providers to also have those very strong connections with shelters and social services and government agencies who will be these first points of contact.
Thank you both for taking time to answer a few questions. Both Mary and I would like to say a few parting words, and then we're going to close the webinar. Mary?
I just want to say thank you to both of you, both for our presenters, and thank you for the 600 people that were on the website itself, and then I think over almost 1,000 people were on the phone call. Thank you for hanging in with us. One of the things that I did want to say is that the OVC website, which is www.ovc.gov, has a list of the OVC-funded trafficking victim service providers who work in certain communities across the country. So check out the website and see if there's a provider in your area. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which is also listed in the PowerPoint, can also connect you to trafficking specialists in other communities. But the biggest message that I hear is that it really takes a whole community to kind of coordinate responses for human trafficking victims, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, people under the age of 18 or over age 18. And one of the resources that OVC developed was the Trafficking Task Force Operations e-guide. It's not, you don't have to use it to establish a formal anti-trafficking task force, but if you're looking for guidance on who you should be networking with and who you should, you should be looking for in your community, and some tips on who you should be partnering with, just to do the work of providing services, it might be helpful. So that's on our OVC's website as well, and the handouts will have the links to it. So thank you very, very much. It was just great being with you today.
Thank you all so much for sticking in there with us. Please know that we will send a follow-up email that will include a link to the webinar recording, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as an evaluation. I see that many of you have asked about a certificate. Unfortunately, we're not able to provide certificates for participating in the webinars. Again, I'd like to echo my colleague Mary Atlas-Terry in saying that we really appreciate you all thinking through all of this with us, your willingness to partner with others from various aspects of the field, whether it's health care, legal, or community services, to offering support. And please know that we're committed to helping you all build those bridges in your local communities too. Thank you so much for your time. We're now going to conclude this webinar. Bye-bye.
Yay.